Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about ways to help news consumers ferret out fake news and instead focus on real news and facts.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. With me in the studio today is Ellen Shearer, executive editor of Northwestern University's Medill, Washington program. Ellen and Matt Mansfield co-edited a new book, Truth Counts, A Practical Guide for News Consumers. The book is designed to help people separate truth and facts from everything else. So welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So what was the idea behind Truth Counts?
Well, the idea behind Truth Counts was the rise of the term fake news, which now is part of the lexicon, but when it still was a new phrase, I was disturbed at the fact that people laughed it off, including journalists, and I just thought this is not good when people think it's funny to call legitimate, reality-based stories fake news. So I had been thinking about that, and it turns out so had Congressional Quarterly, and so we combined forces and decided that we would find experts in journalism and news consumption to help us think through how can news consumers, as well as journalists, really come to grips with the proliferation of actual fake news, misinformation, real news labeled as fake news, state-sponsored propaganda, and privately sponsored fake news. So trying to sort one's way through all of the information minefields out there is a challenge for both journalists and news consumers, and so we hope the book provides some guidance in the navigation.
Mm-hmm. And how did you decide on the topics and chapters?
Well, we really, again, we thought about what are the big issues in today's media environment, and I think what one really needs to think about is the fact that facts have there's a real issue around facts and the denigration of facts, that there are fungible facts. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when he was a U.S. Senator, said everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Well, actually, everybody can be and is entitled to their own facts. You can pick which facts are your facts. But I think what's really happening in today's media environment is we're picking a smaller group of facts, and we're actually denigrating the value of facts. Facts seem fungible, and so I think what we're trying to do is look through all the ways that plays out. So I'm just going to, if you don't mind, talk through the chapters. We looked for experts in each field. First, we set the stage, thanks to Tom Rosenstiel, who's the head of the American Press Foundation, kind of saying, how did we get to where we are today? How did the media landscape change, and what are the big issues we're facing? Frank Sesno of GW then looked at the various ways, again, the media landscape has changed, and where are the pressure points in terms of different information streams. Brian Monroe of Temple University looked at the weaponizing of news and fake news, and how the rise of cable television and the internet before that has changed the speed of news, and also the way information literally is used as a weapon, a political weapon. Some of the more or all the chapters are, I think, interesting, but some of the ones that I was really, I felt were so important was really thinking through the way we, through the way our brain is made and our own biases, how we are kind of part of the problem, and how we can look at our own psychological impacts, things called negativity bias, cognitive dissonance, and we can go into that later, but all the things that our brain actually does to make it harder for us to be clear about what the facts are. So, we're really looking at fact-checking, which has, certainly come into its own, won a Pulitzer Prize, and how fact-checking helps, but also the hurdles it faces in terms of, again, people's biases, and then how people can learn the tools of fact-checking to be better news consumers. So, we really kind of thought through what are all the different ways we can navigate the news environment. A long answer to a short question.
That's fine. So how did the advent of the internet and cable TV affect journalism's credibility?
Well, I think what you see happening, and in some ways I think the rise of cable television was more impactful in some ways than the internet. The 24/7 news environment, which really started with cable television before the digital news environment, meant less verification, less considered reporting, editing, fact-checking, and more fast, here's what we know now, rather than let's make sure that what we know now is factually accurate, let's give the context of it. And I think that idea of context in the 24/7 news environment really gets lost. The other thing, and I'm not picking on cable television, it's just a fact of life. When you're filling the air 24/7, you have to think about, what might be lost in that process. And I think one of the other issues for news consumers and journalists to really be thinking about is, as more and more talk shows become part of the cable network is so much about talk shows. I don't think it's clear to news consumers, and I think that's in some ways caused by journalists, that there's a difference when an analyst or someone representing a point of view is on a show and they're talking from their perspective, and it's usually clearly labeled, but I'm not sure it's always clear in the minds of those of us listening to those shows to keep reminding ourselves that this is not news, this is not fact, this is assertion. This is somebody telling us their interpretation of the facts with possibly a deliberate intent to get us to take those facts in a certain order to reach a conclusion. And that's fine. I mean, that is what editorials are about. But I'm not sure our labeling is always as clear. And even if no matter how clear it is, it can always be more clear. I think that really mixes up assertions and verified, edited, considered reporting.
Yeah, there's one point in the book where one of the authors says that the internet has atomized news content because it's separated from its brand identity and, you know, the mothership, as I'll call it.
Right.
Once it gets on the internet, it could appear anywhere, and it could be, you know, it's not always labeled
Correct.
news content. I mean, it doesn't say news at the top. It might say what section of the,
Right.
of the website it's from. So how is that factored into, people being unable to discern what's commentary and analysis versus news?
Right, right. Certainly, the internet has had a huge impact on how we consume news. Instead of going to a reality-based news website or, in the old days, actually ink on paper, you're now on social media, and that's where a majority of Americans are getting their news. So it may be from the New York Times, or it may be from something called the Denver Guardian, which sounds like a legitimate news source, and in fact is not a legitimate news source. It is a fake news site created to put out misinformation with a deliberate intent, but it looks real. And for a news consumer, it's very hard to know. And in the book, we offer some tips about how to consume online news to try to try to verify where it's coming from. But I think that the point to be thinking about is how what you read on the internet really needs to be fact-checked and verified. One of the things that has been shown to be true is the more shared a story is, the more popular it becomes. It all of a sudden becomes what everybody knows, but it may have started, again, with the Denver Guardian. Mm-hmm. Also, and this is a problem for news organizations, I think, people like emotional news better. If it gets you angry, if it gets you happy, if it makes you laugh. And so you can see where emotion, particularly maybe anger, can make a story spread, but it also plays into those who are deliberately trying to misinform.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned social media. Facebook has, there was statistics in the book that Facebook numbers are that there are 1.3 billion people
Right.
active on Facebook every day. And that's, of course, larger than any single news entity in the entire United States. So Facebook is also part of the problem, right?
Right, right. Facebook is part of the problem. I think Facebook is publicly acknowledging that. They've said that they are actually trying to pull back on the amount of news that they offer. They really wanted to. What they say is that they wanted to be much more about social interactions and building community, and they maybe went overboard in news feeds. We'll see how that plays out. I kind of feel like one way or the other, we all are consuming our information online, whether it's through Facebook, Snapchat, branded sites. So I kind of feel like it's a little bit putting the genie back in the bottle. But I think, Facebook's algorithms are designed to increase their revenues. Mm-hmm. And that's what we as consumers have to remember, that the things that, they're looking at what we do. And surveys show when Americans really think about how Facebook is using their information, they don't like it, but yet we keep using it because it's, because it's there, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I think we have to really be thinking about what we like and what's going to happen if we keep liking things without checking them out. Mm-hmm. So it's really, important that we always remember they're using their algorithms, they're looking at what we're doing, and they're trying to sell ads around it. And so we have to be thinking about, before we press like or share, what are we really liking and sharing? I think it's really a different way of using Facebook, but really thinking about that is whatever you like and share, you're going to get a lot more of. So if you go crazy one weekend and start liking every guacamole recipe you ever saw, you're going to start getting a lot more. Or you know, if you start, because you're curious, reading a certain point of view news, you're just know that you're going to get a lot more of that, and more importantly, a lot less of other types of news. And I think that's the real problem with the algorithms, is whatever you like, you're going to get a lot more of, and you will not get other viewpoints.
So I've got sort of a chicken or the egg question for you. The trust in media has gradually declined over the last 20, 30 years. There's Gallup numbers that describe a decline from trust and confidence in the media at around the 72% level in 1976, and that has dropped to 46%, less than half today. So, how did we contribute to that decline? And on the flip side, how did the public lose their sense of trust in us?
Well, I think trust in all institutions has been on the decline, and I think one of the reasons the trust in media has declined is, first of all, we're the bringers of bad news, and that's not a popular place to be. But I also think that the fragmentation of media has caused a drop in trust as more point of view media organizations have sprung up. I think it makes people believe that all media organizations must have a point of view. And so what it means for media organizations, and particularly knowing that news consumers are not coming to your homepage. You can't just say, this is our brand, look at us here. Showing very clearly what we're doing. Transparency cannot be overdone. And I know a lot of news organizations are really emphasizing that, trying to show when they have to use an unnamed source why, and explaining that. But, I think transparency. And what we think of, what news organizations think of as transparent, is probably not enough. So it's like whatever they're doing, and they're doing a lot of good things, but I think they need to think of quadrupling that. Because clearly, if fact-based contextual news is called fake news, and it's verifiable, we need to show that this is verifiable in ways way beyond what we're doing now. The other thing, I think, is really listening to our audience, our readers, our viewers, about what they care about and why they don't believe us, and then really recalibrating. So making news more of a conversation. And then there are a lot of interesting things that are going on in the news community. There's solutions-based journalism. It's a movement to not just report the problems, and I think news organizations have often do more than just report the problems, but the idea of really saying, and here's how to solve the problems.
Why don't we look at the checklist?
Okay.
Right. So instead of just offering, here's a problem in a 5-part series,
right,
you also are offering solutions that may have
Right.
worked in another community, or
Right.
that could be turned into legislation, or
Right.
right.
And I think the important part of the solutions is that solutions can't just be about what government ought to do, government at any level. I think it also has to be what citizens, what news consumers can do, because I think part of the way journalism is practiced is very much here's something for you, and I think there's that particularly younger audiences want to be more involved. Okay, what do I do with this information? What should I do? You know, as if I care about this, what should I do? And so I think it's not, you know, too often when we think about solutions, it still is kind of, here's what you should ask your congressman to do. At least that actually is a step in the right direction of telling somebody what to do, or offering a
It's
suggestion.
sort of a traditional way of
But it's a
looking.
traditional way.
Right.
It's basically saying, go ask somebody else to fix this. And I think what we really need to do is, and this is something that can be uncomfortable, say there are organizations maybe that are advocating for this. If you agree with this or if you disagree, here are the organizations that want to stop this. But we really need to think about offering ways for younger people, younger audiences especially, to feel engaged. And I think solutions, there are other options, but certainly that solutions movement, that's what it offers. There are all news organizations are looking at how they can better engage their audiences, and I think part of it is, the media landscape has changed, but what also has changed is the interaction with facts, and I think when we get to that, really think that's where engagement and really talking with audiences can, maybe help us create some new ground rules.
And by community engagement, what are the types of things that news organizations can do specifically?
Well, there are the old town halls, but I think it's really smaller groups. I think part of it is literally getting out in the community more and diversifying in the newsroom or in your sourcing. I think there are still large parts of our communities that we don't adequately reflect. Diversity of where you are in not just age, not just ethnicity or race, but also economic diversity. Point of view diversity may show readers that we really do hear all the different points of view and not just the pro and con, which again is oversimplifying it. News organizations do more than that. But I do think that part of it is showing the community that we reflect the diversity of the community, and it may not be that immediately by changing our newsrooms, but at least by making sure they know we're talking to them regularly.
And in terms of transparency, what are things that news organizations can do to peel back the curtain a little bit so that readers and viewers can see the sausage making?
Well, I think even further labeling sources who are not anonymous. Why did we talk to these people? Why did we pick this set of data? Really, almost at the end of a story, in investigative projects, news organizations often do this and explain where they got the data, how they got the data,
The methodology. Right.
We may have to do that more, on a regular basis. And again, it's kind of changing the ground rules, but maybe we need to say a methodology why we picked this story. I think, again, just showing, bringing our audiences more into the process. And, we talked to 20 people, even though we're only quoting 3. So a little bit more of explaining, we sent 3 reporters. We went here, here, and here. To those reporting the story, they may feel like, oh my, who really cares? But I think overkill is not a bad thing right now. Showing that we were careful, that we didn't just go to the usual suspects, and make sure that we didn't just go to the usual suspects in terms of sourcing a story. But I really think a lot more about everything that went into it. If you think about the effort that goes into crafting, how many editors were involved, just more about how many people thought about this, or where did we get this information beyond what is in the story. I don't think a lot of people realize that that there's more than the story is a reflection of a lot of information.
Yeah, and there's actually a really good section in the book that talks about anonymous sources. And I actually like this a lot, that if sources have to be unnamed because that's the deal that the journalists cut with them, be clear if they're decision makers,
Yes.
or partisans, loyalists, adversaries,
Right.
experts, eyewitnesses.
Right.
How do they know what
Right.
they said
Right.
and is being reflected in
Right.
the story?
Right.
Yeah.
And, I know it can be difficult because if someone has asked for anonymity, the closer you get to describing them, the closer it becomes obvious who they are. But I think just saying who spoke anonymously to be able to be candid, is not enough. We kind of get that.
Or ye old senior administration official, which
Yeah.
is a classic in Washington.
Right.
Right.
Right. So I think, and maybe it means that we can't use all the anonymous sources. There's always been a debate about the value of the information versus the harm it may do to the perception of the truth. And, again, I think this gets back to what are some of the reasons that trust in the media has gone down. Maybe it's because we got a little cavalier with the overuse of anonymous sources, which allowed a lot of people who didn't need to be anonymous to ask for anonymity, and we didn't push hard enough. That's my personal opinion. But more importantly, it's clear from surveys that people don't believe that anonymous sources exist. That more often than not, they're going to think, well, they might have just made that up, they, the reporter. So the more we can say we did not make this up, and, yes, this person does have a point of view, the better.
And there are some positive things going on. The University of Missouri did
Yes.
this Trusting News project, and it was focused on brands that people can trust. And
Right.
they surveyed, I think it was 8,000 people, thousands of people anyway, about news organizations that they trust. And I thought this was a really interesting list, the top 10
Yes.
news organizations that they trust. And when you look at this list, what do you see as a commonality?
Well, one of the things that's clear is not all, but a number are public. Public television, PBS, which is also public television, NPR, public radio, BBC,
government.
Yeah. So you see that. Then you see places that do kind of deep dives. The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, which has always been known for investigative reporting, and the Dallas Morning News, which is it's an interesting one to show up on this list, but it's
really the only regional
it's the only
newspaper
regional
that's on this top 10 list.
Yeah, but it hasn't always invested a lot in news, and so I think that's one of the reasons it's on this list, and it does a good job covering Texas, and a lot of news has happened in Texas. We had a president from Texas, and all the border issues. So I can't say other than that it's a very good regional paper. It's interesting that one doesn't see the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN. I would say also, I mean, if you think about it, these are brands that, to some degree, brand themselves very, I mean, Reuters, The Economist, certainly NPR, PBS, they say that it is their goal to be really neutral, that it's a really big part of their brand. So I think that's what you see, is that people believe this is just the facts, and that it isn't fake, and that it isn't misinformation. It's not, that this is just the facts. That's, it's, and that's what I see from this list, that they're looking for just the facts.
Let's talk a little bit about the promise and peril of digital optimization. In every newsroom, SEO is both a dirty word and an opportunity.
Yes, yes, indeed. Well, and I think news organizations have become more sophisticated in their use of SEO, and important news isn't, that the clickbait, we're beyond that. And so even though, so SEO, there is still a way to get people to read your stories, to optimize click without resorting to tricks. And I think, I know a lot of major news organizations actually train their editors on how to highlight that a story is important, and sometimes it'll be something as not quite as hit you over the head as you should read this, but it'll be news that every American needs to know, and it actually is, it's actually important. So I think there are, I think just as consumers are becoming a little more sophisticated in knowing clickbait when they see it, news organizations have become better at that. But it, again, it does get back to this idea of people like emotion. We all, or are drawn to emotion, and so, we have to be careful, and news organizations can't use that type of emotion to draw people in if it's false. And so you just have, I think news organizations have to wrestle with it. And it seems to be working, in the sense that if you say Trump, Russia, today's headlines, if that's in a headline, you're not using Trump or Russia out of context. So I think it's really just not using things out of context and still drawing in readers. You really need great headlines.
Let's go to the consumer side of this equation. So how can a consumer recognize the difference between news and opinion or commentary and or fake news? And we've got a checklist from the book.
one of the first things when you're online or on Facebook in particular is don't automatically share. I was just at the grocery store watching somebody in the checkout line, and she literally liked everything that she saw. And if you're going to do that type of thing or share everything you see, you're sharing a lot of information that you have no idea where it came from. Mm-hmm. So really look at the URL, do some research on an organization. If it quotes the Denver Guardian, to use the example I keep using, go check out what is the Denver Guardian. Look at URLs and see if there's anything odd about URLs. Go to fact-checking sites and see what they've said about an organization or about the issue that's there. And then this is actually something that reporters are often told, and it's good for news consumers to think about it too. If it seems too good to be true, too bizarre, too interesting, too, oh my gosh, to be true, it probably is. And so really, have your antenna up for this sounds a little far-fetched.
Be skeptical.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is look at ads surrounding the information, because weird ads equal weird news sites. So I think, it's just really being very skeptical in the end is what all this is about, is skeptical and going to the source, which is, again, what journalists are always told. Don't believe what people tell you, go to the source and check it out. And I think news consumers now have to do that, because the sources, the news, the information coming at them is so massive that, and now we know much of it is so deliberately intended to mislead them that they really have got to, think about their own biases, but also there are ways to check out the information and take the time to do it. It does require taking the time to do it, but I think if you care, then that's what you have to do.
So let's talk about some of the fake news sites. You keep mentioning the Denver Guardian. There was this really malicious headline on Gateway Pundit about the Las Vegas shooter and his political alignment or alleged political alignment, which is a great example of truly fake news and the damage that it can do when people hit that share button.
Yes. Well, there are a ton of fake news sites. One of the ones that is, and it actually labels itself as fake news. It's called the Ladies of Liberty site, LOL. And if you read the fine print, it basically says, this is meant as ironic, or don't take us seriously. But in the Alabama special election, they put out a story saying the citizens of, I think it was called Borderama, Alabama, voted for Doug Jones overwhelmingly, but that more people had voted than were actually, residents of the town, let alone a voting age population. This went viral, and it was like, this just shows, this wasn't fair. Well, it turns out it was meant to be amusing, and nobody read far enough to realize in the fine print, this site is not, it just deliberately does hoaxes. And that's the kind of, so that's a site that did damage, I would say, but is more just trying to pull pranks. Still a problem because, it went viral. Then there are sites, Breitbart would be one of them, the Alex Jones site, that are deliberately spreading misinformation. And then, there are all of the, as has been reported extensively, all of the deliberate state-sponsored efforts to basically spread propaganda. And one of the points that's made early in the book that to me was just so important, not to think about as like, why does this really matter? The point of fake news is not to make us believe the alternate facts, but to make us question what's true, to believe there is no such thing as truth, or to say it is so hard to find the truth, I give up. And so I think, we really need to think about that this is that a lot of the misinformation maybe hoaxes, which are bad but not intended to affect our democracy. But some of this stuff is intended to do real damage to, not to be too highfalutin, but to democracy. Democracy doesn't work if we can't agree on a common set of facts. We might not agree on the solution to those facts or even maybe how to interpret them, but if we don't believe, to have like a baseline way of agreeing on this is the situation, that's a problem. Not just for journalism, but for us to kind of keep functioning. So I will now get off my bandwagon. But it is, I think it's a real concern to and that's why it is important for us all, to journalists, news consumers, to take the time to try to sort our way through this and do, as news consumers, be vigilant, and as journalists, be vigilant and be sure we're doing everything we can to make it clear to news consumers what we know and what we don't know.
And that's probably a really good way to end this book talk, Ellen. So thank you so much for joining us. We've been here with Ellen Shearer, Executive Editor of Northwestern University's Medill Washington program and co-editor of Truth Counts, A Practical Guide for News Consumers. Resources from this book talk will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.